Today, I'm going to show you how to use the useCallback hook in React to prevent a common performance issue that you may run into in your React applications. So what we're going to do here is let's look at the code here. And basically, you're going to see I have this useCallback demo function. It has a piece of state here, count and set count. It has a function called handleClick, which basically just sets the count to the current count plus 1. And then we pass that handleClick to a button component down below. Now our button component above, it accepts the onClick. And when you click on it, it's basically going to increment the count. Now I also have this button wrapped with react.memo. That's so it prevents unnecessary re-renders when the parent component re-renders. If you don't know how that works, make sure to check out my very last video I did on React.js. But effectively, it's going to make sure that our button component is only going to re-render when its props or state change, which kind of takes me right into the issue. We still have an issue here to where for our handleClick here, we're just initializing this function every time the useCallback demo function re-renders, which means that every time useCallback demo re-renders, we are going to create a new instance of this handleClick function and then pass it as a prop to our button. So every time it re-renders, we are then going to also re-render our button because the prop is changing here. We are technically passing a new reference to a function every single time our useCallback function re-renders, which means that if we come back here and I click increment, you see I console log button rendered. And you see it double console log because I'm in development mode here. But we have this button rendered console.log. So every time I click on the button, even though this function is technically staying the same, since we are reinitializing a new function here every time useCallback demo re-renders, we're actually passing a new reference to a function here for the onClick, and that's going to re-render our button component every time we click on this, which in most cases is actually fine, and it's not a performance issue. But you could imagine a world where maybe our button component is an actual pretty complex component, and maybe it makes network requests, or maybe it has some more expensive computations. Maybe it just doesn't render all that fast. Well, in those cases, if you're passing a function as a prop, you have to be really careful about, are you passing a new function every time the parent component re-renders? And is that going to cause issues in your application? So the way that we can fix this, and the way that we can prevent passing a new reference to this handleClick function on every re-render, is by using the useCallback hook. So we're going to get rid of just this inline function that we are going to reinitialize every time we re-render the useCallback demo component. And then we are going to use the useCallback hook. So now I'm saying const handleClick is equal to calling the useCallback hook that we import from React here. So import useCallback from React. And then for this useCallback hook, we pass a function, and this function will set the count to the previous count plus 1. And then basically we need to tell the useCallback hook as a second argument to it, when do we want it to reinitialize this handleClick function? Well, for us, we want the function to always just set the count to the previous count plus 1. So we don't particularly care about anything other than just making sure that we don't reinitialize the handleClick function. So we just pass an empty array. If our handleClick function had dependencies and we wanted to actually reinitialize the function when some other variable changes, then we would put it in this dependency array right here. But this way, we're only going to initialize this handleClick function once, pass it to this button. So now our button, it's wrapped in the react.memo, so it's not just going to re-render when the parent re-renders. And then also the prop of onClick, it's going to maintain the same function reference. So it's not going to recognize that the props are changing. So by just clicking the increment button, we shouldn't be re-rendering this button component here. So if I clear my console and I refresh for good measure here, and I click increment on the button, you see that we no longer get any console.logs. And that's because, like I said, we're no longer passing a new instance of the onClick function every single time into the button. we're passing it the return value of our useCallback hook, which is basically saying, I want you to make sure this function stays stable. I don't want you to recreate this function every time the useCallback demo component re-renders. And then that prevents this on-click prop from changing, and it prevents us from re-rendering this button component. So in summary here, anytime you're passing a function as a prop, you might have to think about, okay, do I care if this component that has that function as a prop, do I care if that component re-renders when the parent component re-renders? If you don't, then great, just pass it as we did initially. But if you want to make sure that you really prevent unnecessary re-renders in that component, and maybe it's a more computationally expensive component, then it's a good idea to make sure for that function that you're passing in as a prop to just pass in the return value of the useCallback hook. And then the first argument of that useCallback hook is going to be a function in which you do the logic that you originally wanted to do. And then the second argument is going to be a dependency array, basically telling React when you want to reinitialize the returned function. And then this way, that prop is going to remain stable, and it's really only going to re-render the component that you are passing it to when you actually want it to, not just when the parent component re-renders. And likely, you might have to use this in combination with React.memo, because without React.memo, this button component is still just going to re-render by default when its parent component re-renders. So hopefully this was clear. Hopefully it helps out. Let me know if you have any questions below, and I'll see you in that next one.